Hi folks, it's Professor Michael Tafel here, and I'm back in the city of Florence, and I just want to briefly discuss the assassination of a young knight named Buondelmonte di Buondelmonti. Now, according to tradition and some of the medieval chroniclers, this murder is the reason for hundreds and hundreds of years of violence in Florence. Even Dante talks about it. So in this little video, I just want to tell the story and get a little glimpse to see if there's any sort of reminders around Florence today of this famous event, this assassination of Buondelmonte, and to get a little glimpse at some of the kind of medieval buildings that are still here left behind. Now, I'm going to quote the historian N.P.J. Gordon because he sums up this whole situation perfectly in just one paragraph. On Easter morning, 1215, a young knight riding a white horse crossed the Ponte Vecchio on his way to be married. It was the last time he would pass into the heart of Florence. Waiting in ambush in their enclave near the bridge were the friends and relatives of Odo Arrighi. Earlier that year, the young knight Buondelmonte di Buondelmonti had broken his betrothal with a girl of the Amati, Arrighi's niece, so that he might marry a more noble girl from the Donati family. With the words echoing throughout Florentine literature, "Capo, a cosa fatta," Buondelmonte's fate was decided. Just feet from the northern end of the bridge, his body was rent by the daggers of his enemies, who tore at his flesh with anger. Such an act of dishonor had sparked many a vendetta in medieval Italy, and would continue to do so for centuries to come. No other vendetta, however, would become so firmly lodged in the Florentine imagination as this one. Now, what M.P.J. Gordon is going to do in this article of his is he's going to go through all these different chroniclers in the medieval times and see how each of them kind of interpret the assassination of Buondelmonte differently. Now, as the story goes, there was a big dinner party one night. All the big shots, the nobles and the barons were there. And like a lot of these medieval feasts, they needed to have entertainment. There'd be musicians, but there'd also be court gestures, or what we sometimes call fools. Now, this one fool, I guess, was, according to the story, was messing with Odo Arrighi, and Odo didn't like it. He's getting embarrassed, maybe, and he gets in a scuffle with this fool. Well, this little scuffle turns into a full-scale brawl that a lot of other people jump into, and when it all settles down, Arrighi had been stabbed by Buondelmonte. Now, Arrighi is part of a connected clan. He's allies with the Amati family, and this was an affront to his honor. So the only way to make this stabbing right is Buondelmonte has to give something. So Buondelmonte agrees to marry Arrighi's niece. That's the deal. So some time goes by, they're getting prepared for the wedding, and as the story goes, Buondelmonte on the day of the wedding just rides his horse right by everybody, completely blows them off, and agrees to marry one of the women from the Donati family, which is the Amati's rivals. This was a huge affront to their honor. Now, there's some deliberation. How are we going to get back at Buondelmonte? He's got to suffer for this. And it's during these deliberations where Mosca de Lamberti says his famous quote, "Capo, a cosa fatta," which it's translated in many ways, but pretty much we have to be decisive. It doesn't matter. Don't deliberate too longer. Do something decisive. So they decide that they're going to kill Buondelmonte. Now, it's Easter morning. Picture, Buondelmonte is coming from Oltre Arno over the Ponte Vecchio. As soon as he gets to the other side, and in medieval times, there was an old mangled statue to the god Mars, probably left over from Roman times, right at the other side of the Ponte Vecchio. The conspirators waited by the statue, and as soon as Buondelmonte came across the bridge, they all attacked him and stabbed him dead. This was the great assassination, folks, that according to tradition unleashes the Guelph and Ghibelline fight, because the Donati family were the Guelphs. As time goes on, this story becomes more and more legendary, and since it took place over 800 years ago, we don't have a whole lot of facts. Now, almost 100 years after this assassination, it's kind of brought to life again by medieval chroniclers, by Dante, the famous Italian poet who writes the Inferno. Dante was exiled from his beloved Florence due to this factional strife. So he hates it more than anything else, and you can see evidence of that throughout Dante's Inferno. Certain characters like Lamberti is put into hell. The Amati family is condemned. Even Buondelmonti is lamented over, because according to tradition, this is what started all that factional strife that eventually led to Dante being exiled from the city. So what are we to make of Buondelmonti? I mean, he was young, and maybe at first he thought he could enter into this agreement, but after a few days, and as the story goes, he had, people whispering into his ear as well that this was an act of submission by agreeing to this marriage. And we don't submit to anybody. We're the Buondelmonti. And the Donati family was so much more powerful, more noble. And by marrying into their family, it was truly a way for Buondelmonti to say, no, I'm taking matters into my own hands. I'm my own person. But some of us wonder why he decided to go right over the Ponte Vecchio, right through Amedi territory, as he was on his way Easter morning to the wedding. Was that an extra way of truly snubbing those people? But that's what led ultimately to his assassination. One of the chroniclers that's dubbed Pseudo-Latini, who wrote about 100 years later, talks about how Buondelmonti's body was paraded through the city by the Donati family. That's the family he was going to marry into. And his bride-to-be was, wailing at his body. And they were portraying this as almost like a sacrificed Christ type of image, to try to really rile up some propaganda within the city to get people on the side of the Donati. We're the ones who've been wronged. They're the bad guys. So are there any reminders of this story here in Florence today? There are a few, and you got to go down by the Ponte Vecchio and sniff around a little bit. And you have to start walking down some of those small little streets there. That's deep, deep medieval Florence right there. You're going to see a lot of towers. First off, the main street going off the Ponte Vecchio is called the Via Por Santa Maria. And maybe about 100 feet from the Ponte Vecchio is the Amedi Tower. Much shorter than it used to be back in the old days. But nevertheless, right on the Amedi Tower is a plaque from Dante. And the quote reads, and this is in translation, "The house from which is born your lamentation, through just disdain that death among you brought and put an end unto your joyous life." If you turn the corner there on the Via dei Apostoli, you see another plaque. And this plaque starts off, "O Buondelmonti." And it translates essentially as, "O Buondelmonti, many would be rejoicing who are sad, if God had thee surrendered to the Ama the first time, thus thou entered the city." Now, this one's a tough translation, but it's kind of Dante saying if your first ancestor would have drowned in the river, then you would have never been born, so none of this would have happened. The Buondelmonti Tower is a bit more difficult to find. You have to go to the Via del Terme, named after the old Roman baths that were there. And it's just right across the street from kind of the Guelph Tower. And the Buondelmonti Tower is still pretty tall, but I don't see the name on it. Now, if we go to the actual Ponte Vecchio, you will notice there's another plaque from Dante. And this one reads, "How fitting for Florence to sacrifice a victim to the mutilated stone that guards her bridge to mark the end of peace." Now, what's interesting is if you go and read in the actual Inferno itself, 2 sentences beforehand say, "O Buondelmonti, wrong you were to flee the nuptials at the promptings of another. How fitting for Florence to sacrifice a victim to the mutilated stone," etc., etc. I wish they would have included Buondelmonti's name on there. But nevertheless, lamenting, like, "Oh, Buondelmonti, you had to go and marry the other, and that caused all of this violence." I would like to see Buondelmonti commemorated a little bit. I don't know what type of guy this was, but his murder is legendary. It happened right at the end of the Ponte Vecchio, and as tradition goes, it sparked hundreds of years of violence. folks, if you're wondering what all these towers are about, in the early medieval period, all the major noble families had these large towers that dominated the city skyline. I do a whole video on it called The Towers of Florence, so please give it a watch.